So what will it take to dethrone Games Workshop? You know, when we look at the evolution of the gaming industry, I want to say the analog gaming industry, because there is a lot of crossover between role-playing games, board games, miniature skirmish games, and kind of traditional full-scale war games. Components that used to be unique and used to be exclusive from these areas have now really blended, where you don't really know where one begins and one ends. And in the case of Games Workshop, yes, they're a miniatures-based company, and yes, they have some massive scale, some big-scale battle games, Age of Sigmar, Warhammer 40,000, but we also have got skirmish games. We also have board games like Blackstone Fortress and other titles. So you really can't, at this point, say Games Workshop is strong based on the weight of one particular game. Now, if we look back, let's look back 10 years or so ago, when before we had Age of Sigmar, before they resurrected the specialist games, it was Warhammer 40,000 keeping them afloat. Everything was in Warhammer 40K. So that shows at that time a system. It was system that kept them going. Now they've expanded out. Other companies have expanded out. It was always about the IP. It was always about the presentation. I mean, look, we're playing 40K for the bolt pistols and the chainswords. Absolutely. But this idea that things have morphed and things have blended on the analog perspective, put digital and video games and mobile aside for a second. That is revenue. That is cash. That is spreading an example. But Games Workshop competing with other companies for market share, do they have to worry? Will they be dethroned? And what would be a sleeper type way in that I think they need to explore more? And for that, we're going to take a play from BattleTech, because BattleTech has been through a kind of an interesting evolution, and I think there's a lot that Games Workshop could learn from it. So we've got Games Workshop. We've got this massive, massive company. And the IP, the way it has been cultivated, Warhammer 40K, over the years, it's entered kind of into the consciousness of a lot of gamers. The idea of power armor, bolt pistols, chainswords. I mean, we see this in other types of games. And the strength of 40K is literally this mythology coming into play, combined with colorful rules, and of course combined with fantastic miniatures. I mean, I continue to be amazed by the new kits. Just looking at the starter sets with the Necrons, and I'm building up my Necron army, these are kind of mass-produced, easy-to-assemble, snap-fitty type models. They're fantastic. I mean, there's very little prep to get them to a state of model to ready to paint. I mean, just amazing what they're doing. So those visuals are very, very important. Now let's back up a few years as an example. The fragmentation that almost dethroned Games Workshop, but kind of self-destructed because this company did not own the IP. That's the strength of Games Workshop. Love or hate them, they own 40K. They are masters of their own destiny, and they have been mastering that destiny for decades now and just picking up steam. But if you were tracking the industry a number of years ago, X-Wing Miniatures Fantasy Flight beat out Games Workshop for like 2 years in a row and was very, very close. Looking at moving units, looking at sales, looking at ranking, looking at playability. There's no way 40K, and I love 40K, I love the Grimdark, there's no way it was competing with Star Wars, the IP of Star Wars. And what made X-Wing Miniatures so amazing and so popular at the time was this triplicity of, well, first of all, spaceship combat. Everyone can get behind that. I want to fly an A-Wing. I want to fly an X-Wing. You know Star Wars, so you're instantly into that mythology, and it's pre-painted, ready to play. So you are literally taking a similar thing, Star Wars, decades of momentum, decades of IP, but it was never translated over effectively to a miniatures game. I know we had battles and we had a few other iterations along the way. But X-Wing Miniatures made that jump, and Games Workshop could not compete with that. It forced them. I mean, let's be honest. 40K was on a different course at the time. The old world, long live the old world, was creaking along. Those 2 years that they got punched in the gut by X-Wing Miniatures, and those 3 years where X-Wing Miniatures was in the top 3, gunning for 40K, they had to make a major shift, a major decision. Now they did, and 40K is king. But what dethroned X-Wing Miniatures was the IP is farmed out. It wasn't done in-house like Games Workshop. And Fantasy Flight, I don't know who took this direction. I don't know who took it. But Fantasy Flight, what they like to do, and it works with a lot of their other games, was first edition comes out, you buy everything, you play everything, then they kill it, and they go to second edition, and they force you to rebuy everything. And a board game is different than a war game. A board game works where, okay, if I rebuy it, okay, it's a little bit different, but it's not as big. But I can still play all my first edition stuff or my second to third edition stuff. I've got tons of Runebound stuff. Now, I love Runebound second. I love Runebound third. I have them both. I play both. But I could have easily comfortably existed in Runebound second edition. And as a board game, I can play that system with a variety of people and friends. A miniature system only exists literally on the community. You need other players. Now, I mean, I could have every ship and every army and every play it and lend them out, but you need other players to own their stuff. So that is what Fantasy Flight, when they killed X-Wing 1.0, and the people that were in deep, the people that were like sneaking miniatures into their place at night so their significant other doesn't know what's going on. Like they were in deep. And now, guess what? You have to buy $500 worth of cards to bring all your ships and components up to 2.0. Rebuy everything, rebuy starter set, rebuy everything. Like that killed X-Wing Miniatures. It's still a powerhouse, it's still strong, but that slip, that miscalculation by Fantasy Flight at whatever level, lost that momentum because wargamers, they don't want their collection to be destroyed. Now, Games Workshop kind of pioneered that where they're constantly changing the rules. They're making some miniatures good, some not so good, back and forth. They update things, but they never really invalidate certain things. 40K players are like, Fritz, they destroyed my Lost and Damned. They killed Blood Angels again. They did this and that. Like, yes, they reinterpret stuff because they are going to force you to buy, but they don't regularly pull like an Age of Sigmar, kind of completely killing out your old models from that perspective. That loss has now put Games Workshop to a point where if I ask, well, what would dethrone Games Workshop? What could possibly compete? Not Star Wars anymore. I mean, Legion is strong, but the idea is it bounces back and forth, back and forth. The Star Wars IP kind of goes to whoever can extract the most cash. It's not owned by one particular company. The only thing that I could see dethroning Games Workshop, if it got serious, is Dungeons and Dragons. D&D has a massive, massive player base. D&D has the consciousness of the gamers. I knew things were kind of crazy years ago when I was walking down Main Street in White Plains, and I saw a dude wearing a D&D shirt openly. I mean, if you did that in the 80s, like that, you couldn't do that. Like, you couldn't. So D&D has entered the consciousness of the gaming community, and this is a fantastic thing because it lets you meet new players. It lets you meet new friends. I mean, I've made so many friends just through D&D. Even if I put aside all the great times that I've had playing and continue to play, socially it's fantastic. But D&D is a powerhouse with decades of momentum behind it and gamer consciousness and a massive fan base that could dethrone, that could threaten Games Workshop. The duality here, of course, is, and if I'm wrong on this, sound off on the comments. D&D players and role-playing gamers, which I count myself as one, so I feel like I can say this, we're pretty cheap. We're not spending money. We are not spending money. A new book comes out, you're like, I'm not buying a new book. I want that PDF. I'm not condoning piracy, but there's a lot of pirates. You'll buy some extra dice, but the idea of spending money in the role-playing community is antithesis. Now, Games Workshop has brainwashed us for years where you're like, oh, Blood Angel Special Captain, $65 for a miniature. Hey, that's a great price. Let me go buy that. Oh, $150 for a tank. That's a pretty good price. Let me buy 3 of them. I mean, we've been absolutely brainwashed from that perspective. To fight that in the RPG community, that's a challenge. I mean, you'll have to come up with a strategy for that. But if Dungeons and Dragons, Fritz, they tried it. It's called 4.0. They tried to make it an MMO kind of miniatures game. And I know back in the day with the blind boxes, I went a little bit crazy buying the D&D miniature game. But if you had a miniature game that was both battles as a DM versus players, but also a quick dungeon explorer, not the adventure path system board games, but something a little more dynamic with cards, I could see D&D taken in that direction, especially if it wasn't WizKids or something else pumping out subpar miniatures. If you made the miniatures, think about a Beholder. A Beholder could either be a blob of plastic painted awful or something sculpted really, really interesting, really, really fantastic. I think from that perspective, that's about the only thing right now, not a Beholder, D&D, the only thing right now that could potentially dethrone Games Workshop. But even with that, it would require a shift and it would require momentum. Your thoughts. It's interesting for a while there, again, over a 10-year period, GW was on the ropes a little bit and X-Wing was a powerhouse. I don't know. Do we need a Mandalorian game? Like just something to push out there. If this was Games Workshop, it would be Mandalorian limited release miniature, $150. And Baby Yoda would have like some power that lets you like instant reroll everything for 3 turns. And it's also $150. And 40K players would be like, I need these immediately. And it's a great price because it's only $150. I mean, look, GW could have charged us $200. So $150 is a great steal. Like that, to cultivate that in another type of system, Games Workshop has done that from an amazing perspective. So I don't see them being dethroned anytime soon, unless there's some crazy shift with Star Wars, but that's past. But I could see D&D. But likewise, I could see D&D saying, hey, look, we're just going to stick with role-playing games. We'll dip our toes into miniatures to extract some extra cash, kind of like Games Workshop has done with Dark Heresy and other role-playing games over the years. But we're going to stay on our side of the world. You stay on your side of the world, and we'll just leave it at that.